Thank you very much. Thanks to the Clinton School for inviting me. Thanks to the Public Library. Thank you for all of you for coming. I want to talk a little while and then I want to listen. I want to hear you as well. Trish has already told you the bare bones of what my book is about. I wanted to talk a little bit more about it. The wartime removal and confinement of Japanese Americans, which is often called the Japanese-American Internment. It's not exactly a precise term because internment refers in legal terms to the confinement of enemy aliens. And in this case, it was mostly American citizens of Japanese ancestry who were removed from mind. But it's a sign of the novelty of the kind of treatment of citizens by their own government, that there is no real word for it. So people tend to use internment. I tend to use confinement, which is a more flexible term. It's been comprehensively studied by 3 generations of historians, legal scholars, and others. In fact, a lot of the best histories have been by lawyers, strangely enough. These various works fit together. I'm the son of a lawyer, I can say that. But when I did an introduction for a legal case book, I did feel I had a certain revenge. Anyway, these works fit together, if not entirely seamlessly, into a larger overall story, which we can even call a master narrative. And over the years, I frequently made use of this narrative, though I altered a few elements of it, notably in my discussion of the role of President Franklin Roosevelt, who was much more actively involved in the formulation and application of the removal policy than people thought. Still, in recent years, I've done a great deal of further study, which brings me to the conclusion that this overall narrative is fundamentally wrong. And it's not that it's incorrect. I think it's fairly correct as far as it goes, but that it's hopelessly inadequate. And I want to tell you tonight why I think so and explain how I've tried to start in my book to interrogate and extend it. First, for people who are not so familiar with what happened during World War II, let me explain briefly. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 devastated Japanese-American communities. Within days, or in fact hours after the attack, Japanese immigrants, the so-called Issei, on the nation's west coast and they were consular officials, they were Buddhist priests. And thus their arrest paralyzed the community and divided the community. Still, in the weeks that followed, military officials on the nation's west coast, notably Western Defense Commander General John DeWitt, became nervous over the possibility of a Japanese invasion of the mainland. And they singled out the region's ethnic Japanese residents as potential spies and saboteurs for Tokyo, because they belonged to, as DeWitt said, an enemy race. Meanwhile, nativist and commercial groups took up against the Japanese Americans, whose presence they had always despised and who they had become increasingly offended by the economic competition of. They succeeded over the previous decades in banning further immigration from Japan, and in West Coast states there were laws preventing Japanese people from owning property or becoming citizens, or all people of Japanese ancestry from marrying whites. But the Pearl Harbor attack gave them an opportunity to go further, and politicians, journalists, letter writers, crackpots of all sorts spread wild charges about spying and sabotage. Though there was not, in fact, a single documented case of disloyal conduct by West Coast Japanese Americans, that didn't calm their neighbors. General DeWitt said, in fact, that the absence of any signs of sabotage only proved that the Japanese Americans really were guilty, because it showed that a coordinated campaign of sabotage was being prepared for the right moment. By late January 1942, Army commanders on the West Coast and political leaders began to press the government to expel all Japanese Americans from the Pacific Coast, where about 90% of Japanese Americans lived. The pressures from the West Coast brought the question into the White House. The War Department, led by Secretary of War Henry Stimson, advocated mass evacuation. Attorney General Francis Biddle, supported by reports from the FBI, yeah, J. Edgar Hoover is a good guy in this case, supported by reports from the FBI and from naval intelligence that the Japanese American community was overwhelmingly loyal, responded that there was no evidence of danger and it would affect morale. President Roosevelt was too busy to spend much time on the matter. He didn't wish to discredit the military or lower morale on the West Coast from racial conflict. He also had his own racial prejudices against Japanese Americans. During the 1920s, before he was president, he had publicly supported exclusion of all Japanese immigrants and racist laws on the grounds that they preserved racial purity against intermarriage. And he did not care deeply about the constitutional questions involved in mass removal. It would be easier than dealing with the Japanese Americans on the West Coast or declaring martial law. FDR thus sided with the military, and on February 19, 1942, he signed Executive Order 9066, which formed the basis for mass removal and eventually for mass incarceration. As a result of the President's order, some 112,000 Japanese Americans were taken from their homes under military guard. Some 70,000 of these people were U.S. citizens of Japanese ancestry of an average age of about 18, and the rest were longtime resident aliens who were predominantly middle-aged. The Japanese Americans were first herded into a network of so-called assembly centers, detention centers in disused fairgrounds and racetracks, where they were housed in animal pens and in horse stables. After several months, all these people were sent under guard inland to a network of relocation centers, so-called camps operated by a new government authority, the War Relocation Authority. These American-style concentration camps were located in remote desert areas in the West Coast, in the western states rather, and two of them, Rower and Jerome, were here in Arkansas. They were surrounded by barbed wire and armed sentries, and the inmates were housed in hastily built tar paper shacks, one room to a family. Health and sanitary facilities were primitive, especially at the start, and food was limited and of poor quality. Although all adults were expected to work, their maximum salary was set at $19 per month maximum, a fraction of what white workers received for the same jobs. The stark conditions of the camps and the stigma of arbitrary imprisonment led to trauma and conflict among the inmates and sparked several strikes and riots in the camps during the war. Government leaders soon realized that their fears of mass disloyalty by Japanese Americans were misplaced. The U.S. Army created a segregated combat unit, which became the famous 442nd Go for Broke Battalion, in order to allow Japanese American citizens, the so-called Nisei, to demonstrate their loyalty. And the War Relocation Authority tried to devise ways to resettle Japanese Americans outside of the camps. In order to reassure public opinion, all resettlement took place outside of the West Coast, and the government set up a cumbersome and avowedly unconstitutional parole system called the loyalty exams. These loyalty exams were based on a loyalty test 10 years before the heyday of McCarthyism. But the attempts of the government to test the loyalty of those they had arbitrarily confined led to further misery. Thousands of inmates who, either through ignorance of the procedures, defiance, fears of dividing family, or fear of the unknown, refused to answer the loyalty questionnaires correctly, were sent to a high-security camp at Tule Lake in California. Even those who were adjudged loyal, 85% of them, were no better off than before. While some were able to resettle outside of the West Coast, most Japanese Americans remained in the camps until the end of the war, with the consequences to their fortunes and their mental and physical health incalculable. So that's the basic narrative. And again, my problem with this narrative is not that it's wrong, rather that it's too limited in time and space. What do I mean? Well, the old-fashioned narrative looks at Executive Order 9066 and the WRA camps as a wartime event. To be sure, they discussed the backstory of Japanese Americans and the long history of discrimination against them on the West Coast, but they failed to see that the story of confinement actually begins in the pre-war years, with the buildup of suspicion against enemy aliens generally in the United States and Japanese in particular. These actions created a climate and a momentum for mass arbitrary action against Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor. For example, to begin with, federal investigators kept close tabs on West Coast Japanese communities as early as 1936, when the Office of Naval Information employed a series of agents to infiltrate the Japanese communities in California, the so-called Little Tokyo communities, and spy on Nisei, including the JACL, that great subversive group. And they filed reports that expressed suspicion of Japanese Americans on the flimsiest of grounds. The reason we know about this is that one agent who was sent to spy on the Japanese Americans, Hafiz Salish, was later recruited by a Soviet agent on the grounds that Japan was the common enemy of the United States and the Soviet Union, and he sold all the secrets to the Russians. Salish was caught and convicted, and his case went to the US Supreme Court, and all of the reports that he had filed on the Japanese Americans appeared in the court records. Meanwhile, a constant drumbeat of sensational stories about Japanese American saboteurs appeared in the nationwide press, and particularly in California newspapers. Even after they were repeatedly disproved, they kept springing up again. Another point that is essential to understand is that the US government began constructing what it called concentration camps to hold enemy aliens long before Pearl Harbor, in such places as Bismarck, North Dakota, and Missoula, Montana. The executive branch expected war and planned for war with both Germany and Japan, and prepared facilities for mass confinement on the theory that they were going to have enemy aliens to confine. Attorney General Francis Biddle, in fact, announced publicly in November 1941, several weeks before Pearl Harbor, that the Justice Department had finished building a set of concentration camps for Japanese aliens and was preparing to segregate them for a temporary period if the US and Japan broke off diplomatic relations. Now, let me be clear. I don't mean to say that there was a fixed and settled plan for mass roundup of all Japanese Americans that existed before Pearl Harbor. Now, I don't think that. But I do say that the suspicion and the false accusations and the preparation of concentration camps and the compilation of reports all created a climate of opinion in which people were prepared, or in fact over-prepared, to believe the worst about Japanese Americans and to prepare for the worst about Japanese Americans, despite all the lack of evidence of any overt activity. And the planning for concentration camps made a bureaucratic momentum that led to actual camps being not just not a crazy idea, but actually a normal progression, an obvious step forward. So there would have been movements for arbitrary action against Japanese Americans no matter how war had broken out, even if the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor gave a surface plausibility to the case. Conversely, we have to say a lot about the long after history of Japanese American confinement. The conventional narratives that I am building on all but forget the long post-war years after the end of the fighting and the closing of the camps, when Japanese Americans began going out into the larger society. A number of them settled here in Arkansas, for example. But it's impossible to understand the wartime events without looking at the post-war years, and particularly the rapid turnaround of official policy and attitudes toward Japanese Americans in the years after the war, and the limited, though striking attempts by the Truman administration and Congress to make some gestures at restitution. One important part was the Japanese Evacuation Claims Act, which granted reparations for Japanese Americans for actual losses during evacuation, which was passed in 1948. And it actually led to further misery. It led to, most cases, Japanese Americans spending more money on lawyers than they actually got back from the government. But it was the first stop. More importantly, a group of activists from the Japanese American Citizens League a group whose policy of collaboration with the government during the war had made it many enemies in Japanese communities, embraced a strategy of multiracial civil rights advocacy in connection with the NAACP, and the Alliance for Civil Rights in the courts between Japanese Americans and blacks not only led to the end of legal discrimination against Japanese aliens, but eventually the Supreme Court's famous Brown versus Board of Education decision. So it's a very important thing to look at the post-war years and these developments. But an even more serious flaw in the standard narrative is spatial. It looks at Executive Order 9066 only within fixed national boundaries as part of American history, in fact, as mainland American history. But the policy fits into a pattern of arbitrary treatment against people of Japanese ancestry around North America, around the Americas, in fact, around the Pacific Rim. It's vital to study other areas in order to fully understand US policy and the experience of Japanese Americans. To begin with, the standard narrative doesn't talk about the treatment of Japanese Canadians. I was shocked that my work is the first ever book that compares really the wartime treatment of Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians. I don't have a lot of time to talk about it today, but to begin with, there was a long history also of anti-Japanese bigotry in Canada's West Coast, where suspicions of Japanese were nothing new. Beginning in 1902, British Columbia officially barred all people of Asian ancestry from voting, irrespective of citizenship. And after Canada declared war on Germany in September 1939, Japanese Canadians were officially excluded from the draft, even though Canada and Japan were not at war. British Columbia politicians knew perfectly well that if Japanese Canadians could be drafted, they would have an irresistible argument for voting rights. The attack on Pearl Harbor unleashed a wave of hysteria against West Coast Japanese Canadians. Japanese Canadian fishermen were required to turn in their boats, which were then sold off. White farmers and merchants and political leaders then called for mass removal of Japanese Canadians as potential spies and saboteurs for Tokyo. Unlike in the United States, though, the military did not get involved. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police found no evidence of sabotage or military threat, and the chiefs of the Canadian Army and Navy vigorously denied that there was any invasion threat to Canada of any importance. Nevertheless, political pressure from Canada's West Coast, led by Liberal Cabinet Minister Ian Mackenzie, caused the government to act. On January 14, 1942, Canada's Prime Minister Mackenzie King ordered the removal from the West Coast of all adult males of Japanese ancestry, who were then sent to road labor camps. This halfway measure was meant to reassure fears, but it only exaggerated them and led whites on the West Coast to push for complete removal of all ethnic Japanese. As a result, on February 26, 1942, a week after Executive Order 9066, Prime Minister King announced that under authority of Order in Council PC 1486, a protected area, so-called, would be created on Canada's West Coast, and all people of Japanese ancestry would be forced to move 100 miles east of the Pacific coast. Mackenzie King, it must be said, also had his racial suspicions and hostility against people of Japanese ancestry. A week after he signed the order, he told his diary that he agreed that all Japanese Canadians, even the people born in Canada or naturalized, were just spies waiting for the right moment, the signal from Tokyo. Again, the order led to the expulsion of 22,000 Canadian Japanese who, like the Americans, were largely native-born citizens. A new government agency, the British Columbia Security Commission, was created to run the removal operation. The able-bodied men were sent to road labor camps, as I mentioned. Women and children were brought down to Vancouver, divided by sex, and housed en masse in cots in a pair of livestock pavilions at Hastings Park in Vancouver. By late summer 1942, all Japanese Canadians had been moved away from their homes. A minority signed contracts with sugar beet farmers elsewhere in British Columbia and in other provinces where they served as exploited labor. A few Japanese Canadians were able to move themselves to and create their own pioneer communities, but the large majority of Japanese Canadians were sent to British Columbia's Slocan Valley, where they were housed in abandoned mining towns or in a concentration camp the Canadian government built. There they lived in hastily built shacks, inadequately protected against the frigid weather. Except for providing that housing, the government did not give them any financial assistance. There was no medical care, no food, and no schooling above elementary school level. A set of church groups later opened up high schools in the different settlements. Instead, in order to finance the internment of Japanese Canadians, in 1943, the Canadian government seized all property owned by Japanese Canadians and sold it off at fire sale prices in order to make Japanese Canadians pay for their own internment and keep them from returning to the West Coast. Once the war ended, Ottawa issued orders to deport all 10,000 people who were still in the settlements and hadn't resettled east on the grounds that they had accepted repatriation by not moving. Japanese Canadians and their white allies formed the Coordinating Council on Japanese Canadians to fight deportation, but the Canadian Supreme Court and later the British Privy Council ruled that the government had the right to deport whom it liked. In the end, the government was forced to desist from its policy by public opinion, but Japanese Canadians were not allowed back into their homes on the West Coast until April of 1949, 4 years after the end of the war. So the Canadian removal and Canadian confinement has a great deal to teach us about events in the United States. It's not just interesting in itself, especially the primacy of racism. The removal was carried out due to pressure by West Coast commercial and nativist interests in defiance of opposition by military chiefs. West Coast racists in Canada were not appeased by halfway measures to meet security needs. Instead, the efforts of the government to calm public opinion by halfway measures only inspired them to ask for complete removal. The government maintained exclusion of Japanese Canadians for 4 years after the war, when there was no conceivable military necessity for it, and instituted mass deportation of citizens until it was stopped. Another area that offers a useful basis of comparison with the United States is Mexico. Again, I don't have time to talk about the long history of the Japanese Mexicans. They were recruited to work in sugar plantations or coal mines in the early part of the 20th century, especially after the US and Canada closed their doors to Japanese immigrants. And they set up vibrant communities of cotton farmers, fishermen, merchants, and gamblers in Mexico's northern regions. After Pearl Harbor, the Mexican government began to take drastic action, even though Mexico did not actually declare war against Japan until May of 1942. Right after the new year 1942, raids were carried out on Japanese communities in Mexico City, and numerous immigrants were arrested without charge and sent to an internment camp. Then on January 5th, 1942, the Mexican government ordered all residents of Japanese ancestry in the region of Baja California, who were located less than 200 miles from the American border and 100 miles from the Pacific coast, to leave their homes within 10 days. Eventually, some 2,800 Mexican Japanese, who comprised the bulk of landowners in the region of Mexicali, were forced to fill out so-called voluntary relocation applications and move at their own expense from the coastal area. Only a few of their Mexican wives and mixed-race children were permitted to stay. Their unsold homes and businesses, including the cotton plantations that they owned, were taken over by local Mexicans with no compensation. Most of the refugees ended up taking a long journey from the coast, 5 days, to Mexico City or Guadalajara. Soon, more Japanese immigrants and their children were chased out of Sonora, and later the area around Manzanillo in Colima. Ultimately, about 80% of Japanese Mexicans were ordered away from their homes without compensation and forced to relocate to Mexico City or the regions around it. Some went to a refugee camp established by order of President Miguel Avila Camacho, where they grew crops to feed themselves. Others settled on a ranch in Batan, donated by a local Japanese-Mexican merchant. But most eventually found housing and in domestic service, and were later permitted to open Japanese schools for their children, but they lived in privation in absolute poverty. The Mexican experience thus shows us again how fears for security serves as a shield for commercial interests intent on getting rid of Japanese competition. In spite of the fact that there was no state of war between Mexico and Japan, Japanese Mexicans were nonetheless targeted as dangerous foreigners and removed, and non-Japanese Mexicans reaped the reward. The fact that these actions occurred in beginning of January, several weeks before the Canadian internment started and 2 months before the American internment started, shows us that constitutional guarantees in the United States, even though they might not have protected the fundamental rights of the Japanese Americans, nonetheless provided a certain limit and restraint on government conduct toward Japanese Americans. Perhaps most importantly, the existing literature fails to take account of the connection between the wartime removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast and the treatment of Japanese Americans in Hawaii. There was no mass removal in Hawaii, which may sound rather surprising since Japanese Americans comprised about 40% of Hawaii's population, and Hawaii, after all, was the place that was attacked. However, in fact, plans for mass roundup and confinement of Japanese Americans in Hawaii were drawn up in spring 1942 by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and were approved by President Franklin Roosevelt, who pushed for mass confinement in Hawaii in a way he never did for mass confinement on the West Coast. However, General Delos Emmons, the military commander, with help from Assistant Secretary of War John McCloy, succeeded in scuttling the plan. General Emmons deserves enormous credit for balancing the need for labor and security against the fears of Japanese Americans. That said, the fact that Japanese Americans remained at large in Hawaii, the only place on the entire Pacific Rim where the large majority of Japanese Americans were not confined, meant that the military had an excuse to grab absolute power and to cling to it. Martial law in Hawaii represents a unique case in modern US history, where an elected government was overthrown by army commanders exercising unchecked power. Despite promising to restore civilian government, military commanders took power at the time of Pearl Harbor, claiming that there was a danger from Japanese American saboteurs, and held absolute power for 3 years, long after any threat of Japanese invasion had passed. Military rule was marked by harsh and often arbitrary regulations. Newspapers remained censored, and all criticism of military officials was forbidden. The regime imposed stringent labor rules and an absolute ban on strikes. Throughout the war, the army in Hawaii used Japanese Americans as scapegoats, and they became proxies in the larger struggle for the constitutional rights of all groups. And of course, I don't have time to tell you about all this, but there's that lovely book, Tragedy of Democracy, that tells you about it. Little plug. What I can tell you is that, as I say, Hawaii's military commanders had originally supported the enactment of a statute, the Hawaii Defense Act, by which Hawaii was prepared for the eventuality of war. However, as the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, General Walter Short, the military commander, barged into the office of Territorial Governor Joseph Poindexter with a secret proclamation of total martial law that Poindexter had never seen, that the military had secretly created. And he forced Poindexter to sign it on the threat of declaring martial law without his permission. Once he had this declaration of martial law, Short abolished Hawaii's government, dismissed the legislature, suspended the US Constitution, and closed the courts. With the support of Colonel Thomas Green of the Provost Marshal General's Office, who had drawn up the martial law proclamation, Short took absolute control and declared himself military governor. Green created an organizational plan in the succeeding days that left Hawaii with a status resembling that of a conquered province. And then, under the leadership of General Emmons, Short's successor as military governor, the Army issued a series of 181 general orders, which overturned existing territorial law and regulated all aspects of civilian life. Although Japanese Americans were not officially targeted by the martial law declaration, nonetheless, they were especially targeted by certain regulations. For example, farmers who lived near Pearl Harbor were forced to relocate their residences and could not take any of their belongings, although they were permitted to enter the area during the daylight hours in order to work their farms. The two Japanese language newspapers were shuttered for a time, all Japanese schools were closed, and all Japanese Buddhist temples were shut. From the outset, the most prominent feature of the martial law regime was the imposition of military tribunals to replace civilian cases. Although civilian courts reopened a week after the attacks, they were restricted to civil cases. All criminal cases were tried by a network of military tribunals and provost courts. They were presided by armed officers, generally untrained in law, and were classic examples of drumhead justice, unfettered by rules of evidence, presumption of innocence, or constitutional safeguards of fair trials. Juries were forbidden and lawyers discouraged. The suspension of habeas corpus in Hawaii meant that civilians could be held without charge. The tribunals frequently issued severe sentences, including fines and imprisonment for trivial offenses, and there was no machinery for appeals. So seldom did the tribunals issue acquittals that defendants learned to plead guilty even when they were innocent in order to avoid the harsher penalties. Of the 22,480 trials conducted in Provost Court in Honolulu in 1942-1943, 99% ended in convictions. One official who heard cases declared defendants guilty in 819 cases out of 819. After the American victory at Midway in June of 1942 made a Japanese invasion less likely, a new civilian governor of Hawaii, Ingram Steinbach, and his attorney general, now I have a Rick Perry moment, Garner Anthony, tried to negotiate with the army to restore civilian rule. And when they were only partially successful, and eventually it was through the legal system, habeas corpus challenges, that martial law regime was brought into question. There was one landmark case which eventually went to the Supreme Court under the name Duncan versus Connor Moku. And the Supreme Court decided after the war that the Organic Act of Hawaii had not provided for convening military tribunals, and Congress had not authorized such actions. So all of the cases decided by the military tribunals were unconstitutional and the convictions were overturned. But the failure of the court to deal squarely with the issue of military tribunals and the close relation of martial law to the wartime removal of Japanese Americans left the precedents for arbitrary action on racial grounds untouched. For some reason, the Duncan ruling has attracted little attention since among scholars of civil liberties and constitutional law, even at a moment when the American government has again instituted military tribunals to try defendants. It's incumbent on us as citizens to look at the history, thus, of the Japanese Americans, whether on the West Coast, in Arkansas, in New York, or in Hawaii, to understand the necessity of keeping fundamental constitutional rights in times of danger, and to learn the lessons from history. The durability and broad public support of arbitrary actions against Japanese Americans suggests that military rule is not incompatible with American institutions and raises questions for the present era about how to resist or roll back encroachments on democratic rights by government authorities in the name of national security. Thank you for listening.
Over at Sturgis was the microphone, so we're just going to have to scream them out today. So we do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand. Yes, sir.
Loud.
All right. I've never heard such a diatribe against the actions of the United States in my life. This is ridiculous. You went from internment camps, confinement camps, to concentration camps. That's the way your story went. Was there excesses? You bet there were excesses. In any event, human history, there are. You described Roosevelt to extreme. You know how Mrs. Roosevelt's voice was? The fact that she got it out. You described some of the military and their aspects of it that were so tough. There are a lot, including one you discussed, Emmons, that was against the relocation and concentration camps. What about Milton Eisenhower? What about the efforts that man made when he was put in charge of the relocation camps? There was 3 entities, major entities, that were in play at that time. There was the military, the U.S. military, which was extremely weak at that point in time, almost non-existent. There was the American people that lived on the West Coast and the difficulties they went through. And there was the Japanese that were on the West Coast and were some American citizens, some not, and they were equally deserved the credit as the rest, perhaps. GIs were pulled out. They left their homes. They left their families. They left their businesses. They lost it all. They didn't get any $20,000.
With respect, sir, my argument, I will let it speak for itself, and the people here can judge yours and mine. I explained that the American government was considerably less harsh than other governments in confining its Japanese citizens. On the other hand, it's a crime against democracy to arbitrarily lock up people based on their race.
Lock up?
Other people have questions. Why don't you give them
I noticed your head popping up and down as you I simply listen. You don't know what people went through out on the West Coast. I was there.
Don't have much.
I came back to Illinois during that time. You would have known there was a war going on.
Thank you, sir.
Blackouts.
Yes, sir.
Next question.
Yes, sir. Loud.
Yes, sir, I'm an Iraq veteran times 2, and I find,
Excuse me, stand.
oh, yes, ma'am. I've been deployed twice, and I grew up in Japan with kids whose parents were interned, and I find that activity to be absolutely un-American. So I disagree with you totally.
Governor Tucker.
Were there other habeas cases that were filed during the war other than the one that Rose apparently had in Hawaii?
Yes, sir. The question, there were several cases based on habeas corpus and other challenges to Executive Order 9066, of which 4 went to the Supreme Court and 2 were stopped in lower court. The Supreme Court, acting on the basis of what the U.S. Government later declared to be manipulated evidence, found that the Army had reason to believe or fear in an emergency situation that there was a danger to be had from Japanese Americans. Those convictions were later officially overturned and annulled in the 1980s on the grounds of the manipulation of evidence and the lack of foundation of the convictions. In the 4th case, the case of Mitsui Endo, a habeas corpus case, the Supreme Court unanimously declared that the government had no right to confine a concededly loyal citizen, and that decision gave the government the legal backing and the political strength to open up the West Coast to Japanese Canadians at the beginning of 1945.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Yep.
I grew up 5 miles from Rome, and I remember
Could you stand?
standing my question is this. What about the Arkansas laws and what has been done to or for the Japanese Americans since that time?
Yes, ma'am. The question is what has been done in Arkansas law since that time. Now, in most cases, it's a federal question because, again, the federal government removed the Japanese Americans. That said, Arkansas, during the war, voted an Alien Land Act to prevent Japanese Americans who were brought to Arkansas from being able to settle here and buy land. Also, a municipal court in Little Rock declared that intermarriage laws against blacks also applied against Japanese Americans. There was a Japanese doctor from New York who came down to marry his white girlfriend, and they were denied permission to marry. Governor Homer Adkins forbade Japanese American students from enrolling at the University of Arkansas on the grounds that if they let Japanese Americans in, that would clear the way for the admission of black Americans. All of these laws were repealed almost as soon as the war was over. And Arkansas, as far as Japanese Americans were concerned, I believe it repealed its Alien Land Act in 1952. And so while there was never a large population of Japanese Americans here in Arkansas after the war, they certainly were able to live on a basis of equality legally with other citizens. Yes, sir.
Could you talk about what was the Canadian government's reasoning for not letting the Japanese Canadians go home until 1949?
Question is, what was the Canadian government's reasoning for not letting Japanese Canadians back until 1949? Well, as always with these things, there's the official reason and the real reason. The official reason was that Japanese Canadians still needed to be controlled and properly dispersed on the theory that it was better for the Japanese Canadians to be resettled elsewhere. The real reason, of course, was that white British Columbia politicians said there would be rioting or that the Liberal government would lose all the votes of British Columbia if they let people back. I was going to add that because of this policy, the Canadian government, in spite of the fact that a Canadian was the drafter of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was ready to abstain on the Universal Declaration because they were scared that their treatment of Japanese Canadians would be found in violation of international law. Luckily, by the time the Declaration was ready to be signed, as prepared by Mrs. Roosevelt and others, the Canadian government rather had changed its policy and was able to sign in good conscience.
In the House, too.
Yes, sir.
Well, I was interned in Canada, Silicon Valley. One thing I want to bring up, they were, for their own protection, she was run off a ditch. Times were bitter then. People would spit on them and everything. They were confined a lot of times for their own protection, because times were bitter then. But she would run off the ditch, kids, run bicycles on them, and a lot of times they were for their own protection.
The gentleman suggests that Japanese Canadians, I don't know whether he'd say that, Japanese Americans were removed for their own protection. I've heard that argument, but I haven't seen any basis for it in the papers of government officials at the time. And Japanese Americans have always said to me that if we were confined for our own protection, how come the guns in the guard towers in the camps pointed inside and not outside? Which seems to be a pretty strong argument. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes.
And the $20,000 that they received from the government, what percentage of the Japanese went back to Japan to, I guess, reconstruct their lives? What was the percentage and what was the age range? Okay,
the question was, what we were really asking, ma'am, is two questions about who went back to Japan and in what age range, and and what percentage of Japanese Americans got the redress payment in 1988 of $20,000. Now, a small percentage of Japanese Americans, as the gentleman said, were sent back to Japan or did agree to go back to Japan or to go to Japan, because many of them had, of course, never seen it before. They were American-born. My best estimates are about 4,000 of the 4,000 to 5,000 of the 120,000 Japanese Americans who were at some time confined. And ironically, a lot of them ended up working for the US military because they could speak English. But the percentage of Japanese Americans who were still alive in order to be able, in 1988, in order to be able to get redress payments was about 40% of the total.
In the age range?
The age, well, by that time they were in their 70s, 80s, largely. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
How many American, German, and Italian were put in internment camps?
The question is how many German and Italian Americans were put into internment camps? And the proper answer is 0. The better answer is that we have to be careful because people of German aliens and Italian aliens were arrested and given hearings, and in some cases they were released, and in some cases they were confined in internment camps. There were a few thousand of them. And in a few cases, their families, which included American citizens of German or Italian ancestry, agreed to join them. But none of the citizens was forcibly interned, and all of the aliens at least had, first of all, some semblance of due process, and also they had the right to become American citizens and chose not to exercise that right, a right that was denied to all Japanese immigrants.
Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, I've read that though they were small in number, there were actual cases of spying and other detrimental things by some Japanese on the West Coast. Did you confirm that with your research? And if they did happen, did the media exploit it to the hilt?
Right. The question is, what about sabotage or espionage by Japanese on the West Coast? Again, we have to be careful. There were certainly people who were sent from Japan, infiltrated as language students or consular officials, just as the Soviets brought in people to their consulates who were spying, and the Americans, the CIA has of course always had, often had a presence in American embassies abroad. These were not Japanese Americans. These were Japanese who were infiltrated, but they didn't trust Japanese Americans. They thought they would, first of all, they'd be too vulnerable, and their loyalties were not certain. And in fact, there were Japanese Americans who went to Japan to spy on the Japanese. So there were no Japanese Americans, that is, people who were born or long resident in the United States on the West Coast, who were found guilty of anything in any single documented case.
Can you expound upon FDR's problems with Japanese Americans? I'm by no means a scholar of FDR, but I am a fan of his and read several books, and this is the first time that I've really heard someone say that. And I do know that, Annie, can you also talk a little bit about how Eleanor influenced FDR? Because I've always heard that she always had a big problem with what happened to the Japanese Americans.
Yes, the question is about Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, and it's a brilliant question because, in fact, my next book is going to be about Eleanor Roosevelt. And it started, actually, I'll have to tell you, as a chapter of the FDR book, but there was so much to say about Mrs. Roosevelt and her extraordinary actions in defense of Japanese Americans and other racial minorities that that I had to wait. I had to. FDR, again, I don't want to say he was a racist, he hated Japanese Americans, and thus. He was a liberal by the standards of his time. He had Japanese friends, he admired Japanese culture, he didn't think the Japanese were inferior. But like the vast majority of Americans of his time period and his class, he thought, in Darwinian terms, that Japanese people from Japan could not just come and in one generation or 2 generations or 3 generations or 4 generations become Americans. They were still somehow Japanese at the core. And so in a time of national emergency, he was ready to believe that they were suspicious. And again, I don't have any evidence of his saying that I hate Japanese Americans. It's more that he didn't really care about them enough to look into the question and to see that the case for mass removal was really rather weak. And Eleanor Roosevelt, just to say, Eleanor Roosevelt was an extraordinary champion of Japanese Americans. She visited one of the camps at Heel River with no guards. She wrote an article for Collier's magazine, and she made several efforts to support Japanese Americans in different ways.
Motion, and then we'll come.
Would you touch at least lightly on the McClatchy plaque from Sacramento and their influence on the Roosevelt administration?
The question is the influence of McClatchy plaque in Sacramento on the Roosevelt administration. Well, V.S. McClatchy and his brother J.D. McClatchy, who were he was editor of the Sacramento Bee, and he was one of the heads of the California Joint Immigration Committee, which was, and the Native Sons of the Golden West, which were the leading anti-Asian and anti-foreign groups in California. It's not clear how much direct influence they had on Roosevelt. They certainly had a great influence on the elected officials in California, starting with Representative Leland Ford and going up to the Attorney General Earl Warren and the Governor Culbert Olson, who lined up in support of mass removal. Once the Japanese Americans were in the camps, and this is one of the works that I'm pursuing, the Native Sons of the Golden West, with support from Earl Warren and with the leadership of the former Attorney General of California, U.S. Webb, brought suit in federal court to strike Japanese American citizens from the voting lists in order to overturn the birthright citizenship of all Asian Americans. And the Japanese American Citizens League opposed this effort, but because Japanese American lawyers were in the camps and couldn't get access to law libraries and such, they called on their colleagues in the NAACP. And the NAACP lawyers helped write the brief of the Japanese American Citizens League defending the birthright citizenship rights of Japanese Americans and other minorities. And in the end, the suit of Regan versus King was thrown out by the appeals court.
Well, I actually have like a two-part question.
Okay.
My first one is, weren't the citizens of countries like Germany and Italy and Japan, weren't they against their dictators? And my other question is, did those countries, did they put American
The question was about whether the citizens of Germany, Italy, and Japan were in support of their government's actions and whether they put Americans into internment camps. The answer is that, actually, I don't study that kind of stuff because I'm interested in U.S. history. We can say different things. Certainly there were some underground movements against the Nazi dictatorship. There were some anti-fascist movements. In a dictatorship, it's very difficult to be against the government and to make yourself heard. The governments did intern foreign nationals. That is, Americans who were in Japan, for example, were put into camps by the Japanese government, and then they were, many of them were exchanged for Japanese diplomats and others on a neutral ship called the Gripsol. So the people who wanted, the Japanese diplomats who wanted to go back to Japan were able to go back to Japan during the war in exchange for Americans to be sent to the United States. The problem was that there weren't enough soldiers. In other words, when American soldiers were captured by the Japanese, they were often put to great privation, such as in the Bataan Death March. And Japan was an extraordinarily brutal power, but because of the Japanese martial tradition, it was considered an extraordinary shame for Japanese soldiers to be taken captive. So they didn't have very many Japanese soldiers captive. And one of the theories is that the removal of Japanese Latin Americans, about 2,500 people of Japanese ancestry from Latin America, mostly from Peru, were kidnapped during the war, at the start of the war, and brought to internment camps in the United States. And the theory is that they were held in the hopes that they could be used as hostages to exchange for American soldiers abroad. It didn't work very well.
Last question is a motion. Thank you. Thank you.
Louder.
question was, do you think is there any comparison to be made between the internment camps and the Guantanamo camps?
The question is whether there's a connection to be made between the internment camps and the Guantanamo camps. Well, as always in history, comparisons are tricky and difficult. I again compared the institution of military tribunals in Hawaii with the institution of military tribunals in Guantanamo. In the case of Guantanamo, it's people captured as enemy combatants and taken to captured outside the United States, except for Padilla and the others, and brought to an area where the U.S. Constitution has no jurisdiction. It's rather different than the case of native-born citizens being removed without trial by their own government and placed in camps where they have no access to due process. So I think that probably the differences are more striking than the similarities, although of course the element of racial profiling is an important element in both cases.